Hi, this is Professor Dover, and I want to lecture today on Chapter 5 of the Social Work 303 text and cover material on the question of community. So as usual, first I'm going to cover some of the material from the textbook slides with some additional material by myself, and then I'll be introducing some additional material that I think is valuable for you to think about in terms of how you can understand theories of community in relation to our work with individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities, and how you can apply these ideas to case examples and to films and so forth. So in chapter 5, there's a theme that asks a question: is the sense of community alive or dead? And we'll be touching upon that. There's a brief definition here and a brief typology, and the author quotes Maslow's notion of the importance of belonging, but I would stress a more up-to-date theory of human need, which looks at relatedness as a basic human need. So here's a better dictionary definition. Usually, a community is seen as typified by social relationships based upon commonality, either derived from living in a particular geographical location, such as a defined urban neighborhood or village, or sharing a particular interest or goal, for instance, on the basis of ethnicity, gender, religion, or membership in a professional association. So community has powerful symbolism. It's a very powerful concept. So this is a good dictionary of social work and social care based in Britain. Theories of community breakdown. Durkheim coined the term anomie, or normlessness. In other words, loss of a sense of what your purpose is here on the planet. He predicted and showed that industrialized nations would have a higher suicide rate than non-industrialized relationship, and that's found still to be true today. The author talks about Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone, and later I'll be introducing some material about that book, which I find very moving and explanatory of the importance of community. She cites the book Interpersonal Divide, The Search for Community in a Technological Age. So this textbook is really good in spotting important books. I believe she also talks about Robert Putnam's other book, Our Kids, a story of the transformation of Port Clinton, his hometown here in Ohio. Globalization is part of her discussion of community, and it's defined as the process by which all peoples and communities are coming to experience an increasingly common economic, social, and cultural environment. And we often view it as a negative thing, but there's positive things to communities, globalization as well. Threats to the community through the world banking requirements imposed on poor nations, war and violence seem to have come along with globalization, but so has national liberation and the founding of thriving new nations. The corporation and the community. Clearly, organizations themselves create almost communities within themselves. So she talks about the book, The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. I'll talk a little bit later about a book by Charles Perrault, Organizing America, about the growth of large organizations and how they tend to crowd out communities. Corporations, of course, exist for profit, not the common good, although there are also nonprofit corporations that do a lot of good, and presumably some corporations that are for profit also making important contributions to our mixed economy. The tax structure favors big business and building construction, and she introduces three terms: privatization, intensified productivity levels, and the technological revolution. As the more and more shops and restaurants are owned by large multinational corporations, sometimes there's evidence that there's a decline in community and in the participation of the corporations in community life. Since 1970, the U.S. population has increased 37%, but the distance traveled by the nation's fleet has increased 143%. So what we're doing is we're getting further and further away from each other. There's also something I call the hollowing out of the university, where the growth of more and more online classes means less and less interaction in the campus, less and less of a sense of the School of Social Work or a university or a college as being a community. But maybe we can find ways to overcome these through our group discussions and having people talk with each other and communicate with each other in various ways, even through the online learning process. Recently, we visited some folks in a neighborhood that don't have sidewalks. Increasingly, that's an issue. So it makes it harder for people to walk around and get to know each other. So there's a lot of threats to community that are discussed in this chapter, including tendencies in the field of education. And I think the chapter does a good job of talking about the pros and cons of some of these questions, such as the virtual community. But I think more and more, as people relate through machines, the question is, can we keep alive the sense of community? Can we find a way to communicate despite distance? Okay, so some more arguments on this question: is community alive and well or dying off? Bonding in rural communities often emerges from togetherness and mutual need despite physical distance. I'm never saying this properly. Tony's, a famous sociologist, divided rural and urban areas into two ideal types: Gemeinschaft, where there's high levels of shared experience, tradition, and a sense of mutual responsibility, and Gesellschaft, where there is more of a focus on exchange of goods, instrumental relationships, money, and services. And it's supposedly more characteristic of urban communities. And we'll come back to these concepts, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, quite a bit in this lecture, which I feel is probably going to be a little bit over an hour, but I'm going to try to do my best to, quickly move through some of the material, knowing that if you want to cover it in more depth, you can see my lecture notes. Okay. There's a number of strengths found in racial and ethnic communities. Each ethnic community is a system within a character of its own. And she gives some examples of the different kinds of ethnic and national communities. Okay, and then she gives an example of a small community in Iowa where large numbers of immigrants moved in order to find work in a German American farmers community that was where a kosher meatpacking plant moved in. And then there was a mass immigration raid that broke up the families. 400 were arrested and deported. The plant owner was imprisoned. It's a sad story, but it's unfortunately something that's happening more and more right here in Northeast Ohio, where there have been raids by ICE on various farm and garden companies, sort of nurseries, and there's been dozens and dozens of similar arrests right here. Then she discusses the gay and lesbian community and talks about June being the unofficial month for the gay pride marches, which we have here regularly in Cleveland, and where the NASW typically has a delegation. I've participated once or twice. Access Line, Iowa's gay newspaper, published bi-monthly. And she talks about also the deaf community. And any of you who have studied sign language here, or who know somebody, or who have a hearing impairment, are familiar with this concept of the deaf community. Members of the deaf community define deafness as a cultural rather than an audiological phenomenon. There's to some extent, a common language, depending on different from nation to nation and what kinds of ways of communicating are used. And there's a boxed reading on that. Religious communities, more Americans will attend a church service each week than all the Americans who have attended sporting events over the entire year. So on the other hand, there's also a lot of data about the decline in religious participation. Self-help groups, I'll give a really powerful example of a self-help group. I've been recently trying to encourage students to look into one group. It's called Toastmasters International, and it's a group that will help people who want to improve their public speaking skills. So self-help groups are a wonderful form of community. Okay. Building community bonds. She gives examples again from around the different parts of the country, in Mississippi and Ohio, of the way we can try to build community bonds. And she talks a lot about in this text about sustainability and gives examples of some sustainable communities. And then she talks a lot about the question of restorative justice as a new way of thinking about justice. And I would encourage you to think about that question. How can we try to interject restorative justice approaches into our ways of understanding how to work against injustice? She stresses the role of social workers and in their local communities in advocating for social service programs and engaging as community members in working towards social economic development and political lobbying for social justice. And she stresses the need to understand the community within the standpoint of the ecosystems of theories that were introduced in Chapter 1. So clearly, however, I think there are a lot of practice implications for theories of community. And now we're going to move into my lecture notes. For the in-person class, we'll have some discussion perhaps now, but also there'll be a video on this, and the final link will be here when I've had a chance to upload it to my restricted YouTube account. So here would be the link to the Dropbox where the lecture notes can be found, but I'm going to switch right now to the WordPerfect file that's been saved as a PDF and is available to you to read and to print. And I've got quite a bit of material to cover, so let me move through it pretty quick. Introduction. So as we read the chapter on community, it would be easy to ask, what does studying theories of community do to help us learn to practice social work with those individuals and family most in need? So let's think about this question as we move through the material in the text and cover the other lecture material. Okay. Definitions. I've got a slew of definitions here, and I'm going to have to move pretty quickly through them to get to some of the other more, I think, meaningful material. But I want you to feel free to draw upon these definitions and see if they help you understand community in a way that can enable you to apply concepts and theories of community and definitions of community to your efforts to understand case examples and characters in your film and that sort of a thing. So again, let's just skip through this dictionary definition, the social work dictionary. It's really not a dictionary I recommend. The Van Wormer text does a great job, however, explaining complex concepts in an interesting way and tries to engage students in critical thinking about the world around us. So let's begin with some other definitions of community, namely definitions this instructor wrote and published in the Dictionary of Nonprofit Terms and Concepts. Okay. All right. So if I can remember to, I'm going to print this out for the in-person class, but anyone that wants to can print this out. It's just excerpts in the Dictionary of Nonprofit Terms and Concepts. It's still in print. It's available as an ebook. You can read it for free on the CSU library, and I've copied some of the key definitions here. And so that's another reason to move forward. If you're interested in my definitions, you can move through it more quickly. So as defined by Warren, a community is that combination of social units and systems that perform major social functions having locality relevance. And the following quote is from another publication by the same authors. The community is the organization of social activities to afford people daily access to those broad areas of living that are necessary in day-to-day living. So really, when you think about it, people go about meeting their human needs at the intersection of the individual and the social environment. And part of that intersection is smack in the middle of some kind of community or various different kinds of communities that we're discussing here. So these activities are organized around 5 functions that have locality relevance according to that one theory. But we're going to move through these theories pretty quick. Chavez and Wandersman, community psychologists, have developed a number of types of communities, community as place, community as relationships, Community is collective political power, and they point out there are different types and layers of community, far beyond mere residential conceptions. Barry Checkaway, a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, very active in issues of civic engagement and intergroup relations, defines community as either an area in which a group of people live or a group of people who have close ties or common interests, and it can be thus viewed as more than a physical place, but also as a vehicle for social participation and collective action. Certainly we can see that in the movie Les Miserables. We'll be talking about that today. Checkaway points out that while community has a number of basically generic uses, community is also a unit of solution. So he's saying community is a solution to problems. And we'll be seeing some examples from the Greater Cleveland series about how two of the families actively address their human needs by involving themselves in various kinds of communities. So Ang has pointed out that community can also be seen as a unit of identity for its members. Within communities, people often receive what is known as community-based support. Communities have a number of different qualities: community competence. A competent community can be described as a community by the extent to which interdependent components of a community have developed. Okay. Empowerment theory can also be applied at the community level. And we can do community network analysis to try to understand the extent to which people are empowered within a particular community. Communities can be disempowering as well. Zimmerman, another psychologist, described research on empowered communities as involving community network analysis. Okay, I'm going to move through these pretty quick. So there's a number of ways of doing a community intervention, and you'll learn more about that in Social Work 45 in the VSW program, or in the Social Work 507 in the first year of the MSW program, or in the second year of the program for those who are in the Advanced Generalist. You'll learn of community organizing itself. So there's a number of different steps: defining the community, okay, and then to engage the community. Next, to appreciate the diversity of the community, to assess whether in addition to the defined community as a unit solution, there are also other solutions, including at the organizational level and at the level of individuals and families. So these 6 steps are defining the community, assessing the community needs, plan of action, collective action, evaluation, and redefining the community. Of course, it helps to have a theory of human need if you're going to do a community-based needs assessment. And we're going to just skip through these steps here where I go into more detail about each of these 3 steps. Okay. Step 3. Okay, I think that this is a repeat. Let me just get that out of here. Okay. Step 3, plan of action. 4, collective action. So those are the 6 steps. Evaluation. All right. Community development. So what is community development? Community development efforts are made by professionals and community members to improve social ties amongst residents of the community. Okay. And this is a definition from one of the licensure exam organizations that we use here that gave me permission to use some of their definitions. So that's a definition there. So what is community development? According to Dover and Smith, Stebbins and Dover, there are several definitions. Community development is process and product of reviving decaying neighborhoods. The process is aided by successful community building. The second way of looking at community development is improving living conditions and quality of life in a rural area or a less developed nation. Okay. So as part of the process of community development, persons often engage in community service. So what is community service? It involves efforts by organized efforts by individuals mobilized in some way by an organization to provide tangible assistance. Unfortunately, in recent decades, community service has become synonymous with involuntary and semi-voluntary community service hours. Okay. What community-based initiatives? What are community-based initiatives? They're a process in which activities or formalized structures are created to help engage people in collective action. So since 2014, every year there's been a Hike for Hope in Garden Valley that was initiated by our social work students in collaboration with the Garden Valley Neighborhood House. And that's sort of a community-based initiative. So Barry Checkaway, one of my favorite professors, he saw community-based initiatives as organized activities or formalized structures that enable people to develop plans, programs, or services at the community level. They bring people together to pursue common goals, solve problems, or create change. So if you're part of a community in any real sense, your participation in that community means you have within that community some degree of a social network. So here's a definition of social networks. This is a very important concept to try to understand. How dense and what is the social network of the people we work with? There's active social networks, and then there's social networks in which you're sort of part of it, but you're not that active in it, but there's still a lot of potentiality there. Okay. Sometimes we have to do what's known as a community-based social network intervention. Programs may include targeted efforts to increase social supports. Israel identified 5 overlapping types of community-based social network intervention. So we won't go into details here, but this is important material for you to understand later on in your macro social work courses. I've applied some of these theories to thinking about volunteer and voluntary association development. I'm currently working on that, on developing voluntary associations in collaboration with parents who have experienced infant mortality or pregnancy loss and feel the need to be organized into some kind of organization that reflects a sense of community amongst them. And it's a privilege to be part of this. Okay, so let's move beyond this network analysis. And now we're going to go here to the Van Wormer and Besthorn text. Let's see where we're at. Okay. All right, it's going at about 10 minutes a section here. Let's see if we can make it continue to move at least that fast. Okay, Van Wormer and Besthorn's text. Van Wormer stressed the focus is on interconnectedness in addition to place. Community also involves leisure, equality, stability, cooperation, collectivism, interconnectedness, spirituality, extended family, and compassion. These are qualities that are associated more with happiness and a sense of wholeness than with the accumulation of wealth. They are also the very qualities that make for community and belongingness. Another good example of Van Wormer's excellent way of thinking about these things. Okay. According to Van Wormer, Parker Palmer's definition of community corresponds to the one used by her. Community cannot take root in a divided life. According to Van Wormer, there are theories of community breakdown, so we covered those in the slides before. According to Van Wormer, leading British economist Richard Layard concludes, based upon his analysis of economic data, that capitalism's emphasis on individualism and competition has helped to diminish a feeling of a common good amongst people of various classes. Anyone feeling that is relevant here in Cleveland? And she talked about Walling Law. We're going to come back to that. According to Van Wormer, regarding another book review by students in Social Work 303, when we had a book review assignment, which you may come back to another year or so. Writing in his more recent book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, Putnam focused on the decline in social mobility of Americans and the rise in inequality, the growing segregation between upscale gated communities and the dilapidated double wides is something he saw happen in his beloved hometown of Port Clinton, Ohio. Putnam contrasts growing up poor in a small town in the 50s, when there was a heavy focus on helping poor, smart children to get a college education, with the large numbers of children today who are lost to the system. He blames society for underinvesting in poor children. He points to surveys that show that Americans have lost faith in the American dream. I highly recommend this book. According to Van Wormer, self-help groups that meet regularly are also playing a valuable role in preserving community. According to Van Wormer, one thing that both creates and inhibits community is the internet. And she discusses that at length. And of course, this question is happening on a global scale, and she provides the definition of globalization, which we discussed before. On the other side of the equation, NYU philosopher David Veltman points out, global community is becoming viable as a concept. This can break down old notions of moral relativism, of which he's a philosopher. His work is on moral relativism, but he makes this important point. Global community makes universal values more truly realizable, I would argue, based upon the conclusions that he draws. So what about corporations and community? According to Van Wormer, the community is built on the personal relationship, and with the personal relationships as an end in itself, not as a means to an end. Trust and intimacy, the cornerstones of a community, are broken down when relationships are made into commodities. Historically, the corporation arose as an entity subordinate to the state. Corporations were chartered by the government to serve as a certain function, such as building a bridge. The question is, are they unbuilding our sense of community? And so she cites this book again. We saw the citation earlier. And again, another good book is Charles Perrow's Organizing America. According to Van Wormer, corporate control of community life is represented in the community tax structure. And we've got some more quotes and points from Van Wormer. We're going to move through them pretty quick really now because you'll have an opportunity to read this textbook. But if you're interested in which quotes and sections drew my interest, here they are. She talks about rural communities. Certainly we need, I hope we're going to have an exercise on, city mice, country mice, and town mice this term, but I'm really glad that she's covering the question of rural communities. Okay, racial and economic communities. Now we covered this a little bit in when we covered her slides. So we're just going to move through this pretty quick. So this was replicating the previous material on the slides. Let's just focus on this. The significance of ecosystems theory for social work group practice with oppressed and vulnerable populations is in directing attention to environmental forces that diminish personal power. And as a strategy of empowerment, social workers can facilitate such understandings by helping clients differentiate between difficulties that stem from the larger organizational environment and those that are manifested at the individual level. What we're talking about here is consciousness raising. I stress this because it's my belief that ecosystems theory and empowerment theory are really two of the 5 most important theories for social work practice. Okay. And so she talks a little bit about social movements and their role in building community bonds through them. And then she returns again to this question of restorative justice. So just sort of replicate some of the material in the text. Now, since this is a video lecture, we won't spend a lot of time on discussion, but I'm probably going to post a question like this for the online discussion. So I'm interested in what kinds of causes of communities you've been involved in. So this is some of the kinds of causes and communities that our students have identified being involved in. So why don't you share what kinds of experiences you've had in the discussion. Okay. There we go. Some of these may not be able to be seen, so let me just cut these into different pages. There we go. So see if you can expand the list, okay? I'm interested in seeing what kinds of theories you're involved in. Okay, we're making fairly good progress here. Now we're going to spend about 10 minutes on application. How can these theories of community help us to understand individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities? So let's look at some examples from the Greater Cleveland families and the film Les Miserables. For the Miller family, as one BSW student pointed out, the Miller family is one of strength and resilience. There's a deep fundamental care for family as part of the value system that Annette has. Because of the therapy given to the children and the spiritual faith that Annette encompasses, she has community support that can help her not just survive, but to thrive as well. According to the ecosystems model, the student points out, her environment is a pro in her difficult situation. In other words, she's using the positives in her environment to keep herself and her her family and herself functioning. So she draws upon her existing community to help her with support, childcare, spiritual uplifting, and resources of self-fulfillment and income. And so this permission pending for the use of the student's work, and I have another student already given it, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of your wonderful observations with other students. Okay. As the student pointed out, community development is described as a way of community participation. It is a shared interest or purpose on a large or small scale, and the organization of it is considered by Van Wormer and Bastorin essential to its success. Another factor of success is to have clear communication with people from the community to create meaningful results. The student pointed out that Annette from the Miller family became involved in her community, and that worked to help her meet her needs. So for her, it was a resilience factor. She made herself available to her son's school by communicating to them her interest in being involved in solving the academic issues, and to advocate for the school to test her daughter to see how she might retain information better. She also volunteered to teach music at Sally's daycare after noticing that Sally responded to music as a learning tool. So in other words, Annette took advantage of the resources her community had, and she used them to benefit her child's education. The school and the daycare were open to her involvement, and the textbook pointed out that this goes along with the bullet points of submerging oneself in the community and community participation being necessary for success. So this is a great example, in my view, of how individual and family casework can potentially take advantage of macro theories of community to guide micro-level intervention. In this case, Annette was doing it on her own. But if we were social workers working with a family like this, we can draw upon these understandings, talk them over with the family, see how they feel about community involvement. For another student, Brittany Best, used with permission, community theory helped her to understand another greater Cleveland family, the Lake family. Also drawing on empowerment theory from Chapter 1, Best explained that when her daughter Yvonne was born, Juanita began to look into new ideas and activities. This led her to go back to school, utilize her community resources, and more. This increased her power and made herself proud to be in her skin. She did this to give her daughter the best life. Juanita does have her struggles, but overall I believe she is more satisfied with her life because she has Yvonne and can care for her and support her. So Best also cited this passage from the text. The community is built on the personal relationship, with the relationship as an end in itself, not a means to an end. We heard that before, and that's a valuable quote. Best pointed out, in today's society, there is not much meaning behind the word community. It's almost as if everyone is looking out for themselves, their family, and their close friends. There's nothing wrong with this. However, community expands to more than just immediate relationships. That's a very good point. So community involves schoolmates, colleagues, members of your church, team members, and more. To me, this quote means the relationship with other members in society is pivotal, sorry about that, to an individual's life. This pivotal factor should be looked at as a whole piece of an individual's life, according to Best. So thank you, Brittany Best. This is an important point. Once again, we can see how community awareness on the part of the social worker working with a family can be essential to assessment and to a plan for intervention, according to Professor Dover. Okay. Best also found a way to situate the Lake family within the global community. And she cited this quote, the process by which all people and communities come to experience an increasingly common economic, social, and cultural environment. So many of the problems we're suffering right here in Cleveland aren't that different than in Buenos Aires. So for instance, Best pointed out that the Lake family experiences a number of similar environmental experiences to other families, being on government assistance, participating in a system of mental health care, suffering from stigma and stereotypes which go along with that, and so forth. Okay, and so here's the citation. Best, cumulative assignment portfolio used with permission. So how can your case and your film examples draw on these theories of local and global community? Okay, so now let's talk about how theory of community can help us understand films. So for Les Miserables, I'm trying to pronounce it properly. Les Miserables. I think that's close, perhaps. One student pointed out that there were two distinct classes portrayed, the poor and the wealthy. The poor had different levels, which the student saw in terms of the text's use of the concept of subsystems. Some of the poor in the film Les Miserables had more respectable jobs and could afford basic education and enough clothing and food, but other groups amongst the poor could not. So whether we want to think of the poor or the working class, definitely some subdivisions within that group of people. Despite their differences, which might be called within group differences, the poor all suffered. The poor all suffered in various ways. According to the student, quote, the poor were treated as less than in obvious ways by the elite society. This brought suffering, which united the poor together to advocate for themselves. And during the French Revolution, this was in itself a community of activists who were empowering themselves to fight for basic human rights. I think that's really well put by our student, and I'm looking forward to more students watching this film, Les Miserables, as we in future semesters assign all the students to watch the film so they have one common experience in addition to the other films that they will be watching. Okay, specifically Chapter 5 described the industrial economic order. In the film, Marius and his Enjo, I'm not going to even try to pronounce it, his co-conspirator, led the revolt against the French Royal Army seeking justice for the community. So the textbook also discusses restorative justice. For best, Les Miserables can be illustrated from this quote. Solidarity groups such as ethnic groups, churches, and unions can generate power and influence over social decisions as their numbers and activisms allow. So that's a great application of theory. Best pointed out that this was also relevant to the rebel group in the film, the group that started the uprising. Although they weren't successful in the end, they joined together for a common goal. And arguably, I would argue, communities are formed when people go through things together. This is something that a friend of mine pointed out once. It's when we go through things together, we feel like we're part of a community. There's power in solidarity and collective experience. Participating in community action can produce memories that last a lifetime. So, I've been to 2 vigils since the attack on the mosques in New Zealand. I will be going to Huff tomorrow for a 3rd. I feel the need to be part of a community of people of faith and others who cannot allow something like this to happen without coming together and perhaps forming a new form of what Martin Luther King called a beloved community. Okay, additional lecture material from Professor Dover. Let's see where we're at. We're 38 minutes, and let's see where we're at in the, okay, we're moving through it pretty quick. Okay. All right, I really want to cover that material on the bowling alone, so let's move through this. I got some additional lecture material from another text that used to be used in this and other universities. Kurt Ashman's Human Behavior in the Social Environment, and Phil Fellon's The Community and the Social Worker. Kurt Ashman begins by defining a community. I'm going to move through her stuff pretty quick. And let's compare that definition with Barry Checkaway's. Community is a word with many meanings. It's customary to view community as a place in which people live. So we're going back here to some of those definitions. Let's move through that pretty quick. Okay. All right. Pardon me for a moment here. Okay. So again, we're just going to skip through this stuff pretty quick. So this is my own explanation. Let me share this. So when we speak of membership in a community, it's not the same thing as membership in an organization. There's variation in the degree to which a community and an organization per se are identical. So the formal membership in the organization doesn't necessarily mean participation in any meaningful, observable sense in the community or community associated with that organization. On the other hand, a particular individual may not engage in any objective observable participation within an organization. It subjectively may still feel strongly a part of that of the communities associated with that organization. Now we're going to talk about organizations in the next chapter, but I think this is important to think about these relationships between. So, for example, you could be a member of a Jewish religious congregation but rarely attend services, yet consider yourself very attached to the Jewish community. For such a person, the Jewish community is an affiliative community subjectively. So keep in mind that an individual's relationship to a community can either be active or inactive, actual or potential. And that's what is inactive has the potential to become active at various stages of the life course, or depending upon historical events or organizational development. So there's a lot of people going to mosques, churches, and synagogues over the last week since the shootings because they feel the need to reconnect with some sense of community, and they feel the need to express solidarity with other communities. Okay, so take the important sociological study, union democracy. What this study in short did was find that that organizations that were very democratic often had very low levels of participation in meetings because the members knew that if they ever wanted to, they could come to the meeting and vote out the bums, On the other hand, unions that weren't democratic had many people coming to every union meeting. Why? They didn't have much power. They couldn't easily throw out the bums, so they had to come and watch them. Now that was just absolutely not what the author thought. It was a counterintuitive finding and made it one of the greatest books in the organizational sociology literature. But it just shows the relationship between community and organization. So, yeah, all right. Another important point to make about community is that you should not assume that because someone has the markings of membership in a particular community that is a community tie, that's a community tie that's important to me. The fact that a person is African American doesn't necessarily mean that this is an important affiliative community tie for them. The fact that a person is Catholic doesn't mean that they feel part of the Catholic community. So these are important things to remember. Okay, so we're going to be starting to show the movie The Green Book in the summer of 2019, where the African American wonderful singer, he probably felt more part of his performing community than he felt part of the African American community. We learn other communities that he's affiliated with during the course of the film, and ethnicity, class, race, these things all are salient in different ways at different times in our lives, and these are important things to recognize. So furthermore, a person can even be actively involved organizationally within an organization that would seem to carry with it a certain affiliative community attachment, and yet this doesn't necessarily mean that it's an important affiliative community attachment for that person. They may be putting in time out of a sense of obligation or because they are compelled to do so. So can a person be attached to a community in both a geographic and affiliative sense? Perhaps we can put that on the discussion list as well. Okay, now we're going to sort of skip through the rest of this section, but I give some interesting examples of where communities start to come together after the 9/11 attacks. Non-Muslim students at the University of Michigan tried to come together in solidarity with Muslims in various ways, and I discussed that sort of a case example here. Okay, and now we're going to talk about Martinez Brawley and some of her definitions. Okay, I'm going to skip through this pretty quick. She distinguished between structural communities, social psychological perspectives on community, and I highly recommend her work, Emilia Martinez Brawley, who from the University of Arizona. This is actually not the current Encyclopedia Social entry, but it's a valuable one. Okay, let's see where we're at. I think we're up here with case examples. All right. Okay. All right. These concerns, the question that the chapter addresses as to are we losing or gaining community, are old communities dying out, new ones are being built? It's a very important question. And so this was addressed by the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And I want to introduce a story he told in his preface and in his introduction. Before October 29, 1997, John Lambert and Andy Boschma knew each other only through their local bowling league at the Ypsi Arbor Lanes in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Lambert, a 64-year-old retired employee of the University of Michigan Hospital, had been on a kidney transplant waiting list for 3 years when Boschma, a 33-year-old accountant, learned casually of Lambert's need and unexpectedly approached him to offer to donate one of his kidneys. Andy saw something in me that others didn't, said Lambert. When we were in the hospital, Andy said to me, John, I really like you and have a lot of respect for you. I wouldn't hesitate to do this all over again. I got choked up. Boschma returned the feeling. I obviously feel a kinship with Lambert. I cared about him before, but now I'm really rooting for him. This moving story speaks for itself, but the photograph that accompanied this report in the Ann Arbor News reveals that in addition to their differences in profession and generation, Boschma, the donor, is white, and Lambert, the recipient, is African American. That they bowled together made all the difference. And Putnam concludes, in small ways like this, and in larger ways too, we Americans need to reconnect with one another. That is the simple argument of this book. So what do you think? Does this say something about the power of community? That just being in the bowling league together, not even knowing each other, could lead one person to donate a kidney. So that footnote refers to my posting in an online listserv. And much of that language was used with permission by the author, who just really wanted to make that last point, drawing upon my account on a listserv. In small ways like this, and in larger ways too, we Americans need to reconnect with one another. That's the simple argument of this book. And here are the two individuals. I have this clipping somewhere, and I'm so glad to see it's also on the internet. So there, the donor, Andy, on the left, meets John Lambert during their league night. They were only acquaintances. But when Lambert needed a kidney, Boschman donated one of his. I bet you some of the auto workers down there in Youngstown are losing their jobs. So we'll be helping each other out in lots of ways in the years to come, despite losing their job. Okay, because they may have a sense of community. Many of them may have been part of the Wildcat Strike that united the black and white workers in the Lordstown Wildcat Strike about 30 years ago. So in that footnote, Putnam acknowledged me for the above posting. That they bowled together made all the difference was something I had said, but I think that his rendition and putting together with his book was a very powerful thing to do. Let's take another look at the question of community. A mentor and a donor save each other's lives. Dale Enser was desperate when he walked into a 12-step addiction recovery program 5 years ago. That's when he met a man named Dexter who offered to help Enser along the path to sobriety. Dexter took me under his wings and showed me the ropes. I couldn't get it in my brain that there are people who care for me and so forth. When McElrath's kidneys began to fail, he went on dialysis, awaiting a kidney. Two people offered, but it wasn't a match. Finally, one of his fellow members from his 12-step addiction recovery program offered a kidney. And it turns out it was a match. So I'm standing here using his kidney. Okay, so how's that for a sense of community? Being in AA or NA together was enough to result in a kidney donation. So this is another wonderful story of the manner in which co-participation in a voluntary association produces an act of extraordinary altruism. This time it involves membership in a 12-step recovery program rather than a bowling league. Once again, it involves a kidney donation, and once again, it appears to have an interracial element. In other words, community can bring people together. Yes, and once again, there was an interracial element according to the accounts on that story. And now we're working to try to bring together primarily African American, but other as well, women and parents and grandparents who have suffered pregnancy and infant loss. They have an annual gathering where they light candles and remember the lost one. And now they will also find ways to get together at least annually and form an association of some kind that can advocate and educate and support each other. Unfortunately, its community is not all, positive. There's tension between society and community. Later we'll talk about a theorist who argues about this tension and talks about the role of large organizations in tearing down communities. This Gemeinschaft distinction between community and commodity is an important one to come back to periodically. Okay. So let's see where we're at right now. We are 50 minutes in. I'm going to go up to the top, and we're just going to skip through this stuff real quick here. This is a return to some of the earlier definitions and work in a little bit more depth of Fallon and Martinez-Brawley. And if you're interested, you'll have my lecture notes. As soon as I'm doing this now, I'm going to shrink them down to 12 points and eliminate these page breaks so that you will have a printable form of these notes. And it will only take a couple of minutes to read through them. And yeah, so that's what we're going to do right now. Let me just do it. I've learned this from 10 or more years of being a caseworker. Do 4 when you're with. When you're with a client and you need to write a letter for them, do it right there when you're with them. Don't do it later because another client will come along. Another demand on my time will come along. So I'm going to do this right now. What I often do, we're going to go like this, and we're going to look for the codes, hard page, and we're going to replace them with codes, 2 hard returns. But this is just another example. The kinds of technological skills, whether it's Blackboard or TaskStream and Turnitin and all the Medicaid payment systems that you're going to have to learn how to cope with. It can be really a pain. But there we are. Here's the lecture notes. We'll save them as a PDF. And you'll be able to print them. And this is, I believe, a superior way to having lecture notes than PowerPoints, because PowerPoints are sort of hard to print. So there we are. And there's only 22 pages at 12-point font. And we kept the lecture under an hour. And I'm really looking forward to your answers on how to apply concepts of community to understand your case examples, which in spring of 19 are still the Greater Cleveland series, and we'll be looking for other kinds of case examples in the future. We may focus on one family, the corporate family, because it's got the most on it, and we'll be looking at other movies again coming forward. And I'm really I'm so glad to be able to teach this course and and to read what you have to write. And as you can see, some of your writing is helping to inform teaching and learning in the practice of social work. That's one of my favorite books, Teaching and Learning in the Practice of Social Work by Bertha Capon Reynolds, available in the CSU library. So good night, everyone, and I'll see you in class, talk with you online. I'll see you in my office hours, and have a great week or weekend.